Every wagon but one appeared to have a canvas cover on hoops. Rand was probably inside one of the others, and a good deal more comfortable out of the sun than Perrin was, sweat rolling down his neck. He was telling me of the Battle of Emmons Field, Morello went on, and your Two Rivers campaign, Lord Barra. It would honor me greatly to hear of your battles from yourself. Abruptly, Perrin sat up stiff in his saddle, staring at the boy. No, not a boy, despite those pink cheeks and that open face. Morello was surely as old as he himself, but the man's scent, all bright and quivering slightly, Perrin very nearly groaned. He had smelled that from young boys back home, but to be hero-worshipped by a man his own age was almost more than he could take. If that had been the worst of it, though, he would hardly have minded. He expected the Aiel and the Carrienen not to like one another. He should have expected a young man who had never seen a battle to look up to one who had fought Trollocs. It was the things he could not have foreseen that frayed his nerves. The unforeseen could bite you on the ankle when you least expected it, and could least afford to be distracted. Except for Gaul and Ruark, every Aielman wore a strip of crimson cloth tied around his temples with that black and white disc above his brows. Perrin had seen them in Carrion and in Camelin. But now, when he asked Gaul, and then Ruark, if that marked them as this Siswayaman Ruark had spoken of, both men tried to pretend they did not know what he was talking about, as if they could not see red headbands on 5,000 men. Perrin even asked the man who seemed to be in charge under Ruark, Urien, Two Spires Rain, whom Perrin had met long ago, but Urien seemed not to understand either. Well, Ruark had said he could only bring Siswayaman, so that was how Perrin thought of them, even if he did not know what it meant. What he did know was there might be trouble between Siswayaman and the maidens. When some of those men looked at the maidens, Perrin caught a whiff of jealousy. When some of the maidens looked at the Siswayaman, their scent made him think of a wolf hunkering over the carcass of a deer, not meaning to let any other of the pack have a bite if she choked to death swallowing it all. He could not begin to fathom why, but there it was, and sharp. That was a maybe, though, some time to come. Other things were not. For the first 2 days after leaving the city, Sulin and Nandera both put themselves forward whenever Ruark said anything concerning the maidens. Every time Sulin backed away, blushing, but she was right there the next time, every time. The second evening, when camp was made, they tried to kill each other with their bare hands. At least, that was what it looked like to Perrin, kicking each other, hitting with fists, tossing each other to the ground, bending arms so that he was sure bones must break, until whoever was at a disadvantage managed to free herself with a twist or a blow. Ruark stopped him when he tried to interfere and looked surprised that he wanted to. A good many of the Carrienen and Mayenners gathered around to watch and place bets, but no Aiel so much as glanced at the fight, not even the wise ones. Finally, Sulin had Nandera face down with an arm doubled painfully behind her. Seizing Nandera's hair, she slammed the other woman's head against the ground until she lay limp. For a long time, the older woman stood looking down at the one she had beaten. Then Sulin heaved the unconscious Nandera up onto her shoulders and staggered away with her. Perrin assumed that Sulin would do the talking from then on, but such was not the case at all. She was still always there, but a bruised Nandera answered Ruark's questions and took his commands, while an equally bruised Sulin kept silent. And when Nandera asked Sulin to do something, she did it without hesitation. Perrin could only scratch his head and wonder whether he had actually seen the fight end as he thought it had. The wise ones always walked alongside the road in groups that varied in size and seemed to shift members constantly. By the end of the first day, Perrin realized that all that shifting really centered around two women, Soralea and Amis. By the end of the second, he was sure the two were urging very different viewpoints. There were too many glares and frowns. Now and then, Perrin heard Aes Sedai mentioned. He caught snatches about custom and battle, but never enough to understand. Amis began backing down more slowly and blushing considerably less. Sometimes Ruark smelled faintly anxious when he looked at his wife, but that was the only sign he saw anything. By the third camp out of the city, Perrin half expected to see Sulin and Andera's fight repeated between wise ones. Instead, the two women took a water skin and went off a little distance, where they sat by themselves on the ground and removed their folded scarves so their long hair hung loose. He watched them into moonlit darkness, keeping far enough back that he would not eavesdrop even by accident, until he went to his own bed. But all they did was drink cups of water and talk. The next morning, the rest of the wise ones still shifted from group to group, but before the long column had covered 3 miles, Perrin realized that all centered on Sorlia now. Now and then she and Amis went off to one side of the road by themselves to talk, but there were no more glares. Had they been wolves, Perrin would have said a challenge to the pack leader had been defeated. But by their sense, Sorlia accepted Amis almost as an equal now, which did not fit wolves at all. The 7th day out of Carien, riding beneath a broiling morning sun, he was worrying about what sort of surprise the Aiel were going to give him next, worrying about whether the Aiel and Carienan would stay away from each other's throats another day, about what he was going to do when he caught the Aes Sedai in another 3 or 4 days. All of that vanished at ascending from Halftail. There was a large party of men, and women maybe, wolves sometimes had difficulty telling male humans from female, only a few miles to the west and riding hard in the same direction Perrin was heading. It was the sketchy image of the 2 banners they rode behind that drew Perrin up. He was surrounded quickly by Dobrain and Urella, Ruark and Urien, Andera and Sulin, Sorlia and Amis. "Keep on," he told them, turning Stayer west. "We may have a few friends to join us, but we don't want to lose any time." They did keep on as he rode away, but they did not let him go alone. Before he covered a quarter of a mile, he was trailed by a dozen of the winged guards, and as many Carienan, at least 20 maidens led by Sulin, and an equal number of Siswayaman, behind a gray-haired man with green eyes and a face that appeared to have been used to break stone. Perrin was only surprised there was not a wise one or two. "Friends," Sulin murmured to herself, trotting at his stirrup. "Friends who appear suddenly, with no warning, and he suddenly just knows they are there." Looking up at him, she spoke louder. "I would not like to see you trip over a pillow and fall on your nose again." Perrin shook his head, wondering what other cudgels he had given her while she masqueraded as a servant. Aiel were strange. By the sun, he rode for nearly an hour, guided by the wolves, as surely as an arrow to target. And when he topped a low rise, he was not surprised by what he saw perhaps 2 miles ahead. Mounted men in a long column of 2s, 2 Rivers men, with his own red wolf-head banner at their head, streaming on a light breeze. What did surprise him was that there really were women with them, 9, he counted, and a number of men he was sure were not 2 Rivers folk. What tightened his jaw was the second banner, the Red Eagle of Manetherin. He could not say how many times he had told them not to take one of those out of the 2 rivers. One of the few things he had not been able to stop back home just by suggesting was the flying of that flag. Still, the wolves' imperfect sending of the banners had prepared him. They saw him and his companions quickly, of course. There were good eyes in that band. They drew up, waiting, and some unlimbered bows from their backs, the great 2 Rivers bows that could kill a man at 300 paces and more. "No one get in front of me," Perrin said. "They'll not shoot if they recognize me." "It seems yellow eyes see far," Sulin said flatly. A number of the others were looking at him oddly. "Just stay behind me," Perrin sighed. As he rode closer at the head of his strange party, bows that had been raised were lowered and arrows unnocked. They had Stepper, he saw with delight, and with less delight, Swallow. Aiel would never forgive him if he let her black mare be injured. It would be good to be back on his gray, but maybe he would keep Stayer as well. A lord could have 2 horses. even a lord who might not have more than another 4 days to live. Daniel rode out from the Two Rivers column, knuckling his thick mustaches, and Aram, and the women rode with them. Perrin recognized ageless Aes Sedai faces even before he picked out Perrin and Alana, both riding to the rear of the women. He did not know any of the others, but he was certain who they were, if not how they had gotten here. 9. 9 Aes Sedai could be more than useful in 3 or 4 days now. Yet how far could he trust them? They were 9, and Rand had told them only 6 could follow him. He wondered which one was Mirana, their leader. A square-faced Aes Sedai, who looked like a farmer beneath her agelessness, spoke before Daniel could. Her mount was a solid brown mare. So you are Perrin Barat. Lord Perrin, I should say. We've heard a great deal about you. It is a surprise to meet you here, an arrogant, if beautiful woman said coolly. With such odd companions. She rode a dark gelding with a fierce eye. Perrin would have wagered the animal had trained as a warhorse.
Hey,
We thought
Christopher, how
sure
you
you would be
doing?
ahead of us yet. Ignoring them, one of those two
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien.
must be Mirana, and he was not certain what to say to her yet. Perrin looked at Daniel. Not that I'm displeased, but how did you come here? Daniel glanced at the Aes Sedai and stroked his mustaches furiously. We started out like you said, Lord Perrin, and as fast as we could. I mean, we left the wagons and all, since it seemed there must be some reason for you to leave so quick. Then Karuna Sedai and Bera Sedai and the others caught us up. And they said Ilana could find Rand. The Lord Dragon, I mean. And since you went with him, I thought sure you'd be wherever he was.
Excuse
No
me.
way to tell us if you'd gone from Kyrian, and... He drew a deep breath. Anyway, it seems they were right.
That's
Weren't
good
they,
to
Lord
hear,
Perrin?
Chris.
Perrin frowned, wondering how Ilana could find Rand. But she must be able to, or Daniel and the rest would not be here. She and Baron were continuing to stay back with a slim, hazel-eyed woman who seemed to sigh often. I am Bera Harkin, the square-faced woman said, and this is Karuna Nachimam. She indicated her haughty companion. Apparently the others could do without introductions yet.
I'm not doing
Will
too
you tell
bad.
us why
Can't
you are
complain
here
too
when young
much.
Althor, the Lord Dragon, is several days north? It did not take much consideration. If these 9 meant to join the Aes Sedai ahead, there was little he could do to stop it. 9 Aes Sedai on his side, however. He's being held prisoner. An Aes Sedai named Koiran and at least 5 others are taking him to Tarvalin. At least they mean to.
Oh, yeah.
I mean to stop them. That caused considerable shock, with Daniel's eyes widening and Aes Sedai all talking at once. Aram was the only one who did not appear affected, but then he did
Give me
not seem
one
to care
second.
much about anything except Perrin and his sword. The smells from the Aes Sedai were all outrage and fear for all their calm faces. We have to stop them, Bera, came from a woman with her hair in beaded Tarabana braids, just as a pale Karianan woman on a lanky bay mare said, We cannot allow Elida to have him, Bera. 6, the hazel-eyed woman said incredulously. 6 could not take him, I am sure of it. I told you he was injured, Ilana half wept. Perrin knew her scent well enough to pick it out. She smelled of pain. I told you. Perrin kept silent, but she smelled furious and afraid. Karuna ran a dark, contemptuous gaze over Perrin's party. You mean to stop Aes Sedai with this young man? Perrin did not say you were a fool. I have a few more than this back on the Tarvalin Road, he said dryly. Then you may join them to us, Karuna told him, as though making a concession. That will be all right, Bera, will it not? Bera nodded. He could not understand why Karuna's attitude grated at him so, but this was no time to try puzzling it out. I also have 300 Two Rivers archers I intend to take back to the road with me. How could Ilana know whether Rand was hurt? You Aes Sedai are welcome to come along. They did not like it, certainly. They rode off a dozen paces to one side to discuss it. Even his ears heard nothing. They must have been using the power somehow. And for a time, Perrin thought they were going to ride on alone. In the end, they did come, but Bera and Karuna rode on either side of him all the way back to the road, taking turns telling him how dangerous and delicate this situation was, and he must do nothing that might endanger young Althor. Bera at least remembered to call Rand the Dragon Reborn sometimes. One thing they made quite clear was that Perrin was not to so much as put one foot in front of the other without asking them first. Bera began to seem a little vexed that he would not repeat her words back to her. Karuna seemed to take them for said. Perrin began to wonder whether he had made a mistake asking them to come. If the Aes Sedai were impressed by the collection of Aiel and Mayenners and Carianan marching along the road, they gave no sign to either eye or nose. They did add their little bit to the bubbling of the kettle, though. The Mayenners and Carianan seemed very heartened at the appearance of 9 Aes Sedai and 16 warders, and they nearly bowed and scraped whenever one of the women came close. Maidens and Siswayaman looked at the Aes Sedai as though they expected the women to crush them underfoot. But though the wise ones kept faces as smooth as the Aes Sedai, Perrin smelled waves of pure fury from them. Except for a brown named Masuri, the Aes Sedai ignored the wise ones entirely at first. But after Masuri had been rebuffed at least 24 times over the next few days, she was persistent, yet the wise ones avoided the Aes Sedai so smoothly that Perrin thought they must do it by instinct. After that, Bera and Karuna and all the rest were constantly looking at the wise ones and talking among themselves behind some invisible barrier that kept Perrin from hearing what they said. He would have eavesdropped if he could. They were hiding more than talk about the Aiel women. For one thing, Ilana refused to tell him how she knew where Rand was. "There is knowledge that would burn any mind but Aes Sedai," she had told him, cool and mysterious, but she fairly reeked of anxiety and pain, and she would not even admit to having said he was injured in some way. Perrin hardly said a word to him, only watched everything with those dark bird-like eyes and a small secret smile. Yet she gave off waves of frustration and anger. By smell, he would have said Bera or Karuna was the leader. Bera, he thought, though it was close and sometimes seemed to shift the other way for a time. It was hard to say otherwise, though one or the other rode beside him a good hour every day, repeating variations of their original advice and generally assuming they were in charge. Nirella seemed to think they were, taking their commands without so much as a glance at Perrin, and Dobrain did no more than glance first. For a full day and a half, Perrin assumed Mirana had remained in Caemlyn, and it came as a shock to hear the slim hazel-eyed woman addressed by that name. Rand had said she headed the embassy from Saladar, but for all that the Aes Sedai appeared equals on the surface, Perrin marked her as low wolf in the pack. Dull resignation and anxiety filled her scent. No surprise that Aes Sedai kept secrets, of course, but he intended to rescue Rand from Coiron and a lot ahead, and he would have liked a hint as to whether he would have to rescue him from Karuna and her friends. At least it was good being reunited with Daniel and the others, even if they were nearly as bad around the Aes Sedai as the Mayenners and Carianan. The Two Rivers men were so glad to see him that few even grumbled when he told them to put away the Red Eagle. It would come out again, Perrin was sure, but Daniel's cousin Ban, who looked almost exactly like him, except for a pickaxe nose and long thin mustaches in the Damani manner, folded it carefully into his saddlebags. They did not go on without banners, of course. For one thing, there was his own red wolf head. They might have ignored him if he'd told them to pack that away, and for some reason, Karuna's cool, disdainful gaze made him want to display it. But beside that, Dobrain and Nirella produced banners, since one had been shown already. Not the rising sun of Carian, or the golden hawk in flight of Mayan. Each had brought a pair of Rand's standards, the dragon red and gold on white, and the black and white disc on crimson. The Aiel did not seem to care one way or another, and the Aes Sedai were very cold, but they seemed fitting ensigns to go on behind. On the 10th day, with the sun almost halfway to its peak, Perrin was feeling grim despite Banners and Two Rivers men and Stepper under him. They should overtake the Aes Sedai wagons not long after noon. But he still did not know what to do after that. It was then that the sending came from the woods. Come now, many two legs, many legs. Come now. Chapter 55, the last chapter. Dumai's Wells. Gawain tried to keep his mind on the landscape as he rode at the head of the column. This sort of rolling terrain, with its scattered bunches of trees, was just flat enough to make you think you could see a long way, when in truth some of those occasional long ridges and low hills were not quite so low as they seemed. The wind was gusting up waves of dust today, and dust could hide a lot too. Right just off the road, 3 stone wells and a small copse. The water barrels could stand topping, and it was at least 4 days to the next sure water, if the Alianella spring had not gone dry. But Galena had ordered no stopping. He tried to hold his attention where it should be, but he could not. From time to time he twisted in his saddle, looking back at the long snake of wagons stretching along the road, with Aes Sedai and warders riding alongside, and servants who were not in the wagons walking. Most of the younglings were at the rear, where Galena had ordered them. He could not see the one wagon, in the center of the column, with 6 Aes Sedai always riding beside it, that had no canvas cover. He would have killed Althor if he could, but this, even had refused to take part any longer after the second day, and the light knew she had cause. Galena was adamant, though. Putting his eyes firmly forward, he touched Egwene's letter in his coat pocket, where it lay carefully wrapped in layers of silk. Just a few words to say she loved him, that she must go. No more. He read it 5 or 6 times a day. She never mentioned his promise. So he had not raised a hand against Althor. He had been stunned to learn the man was a prisoner, and had been for days when he heard of it. Somehow he must make her understand that. He had promised her not to raise his hand against the man, and he would not if he died for it. But he would not raise a hand to help him either. Egwene had to understand that. Right, she had to. Sweat trickled down his face, and he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Egwene he could do nothing about yet, except pray. He could about Min. Somehow he had to. She did not deserve to be carried to the tower a prisoner. He would not believe it. If the warders would only slacken the guard on her, he could... Suddenly Gawain became aware of a horse galloping back down the road toward the wagons through sheets of dust, seemingly with no rider. "Giselle!" he ordered. "Tell the wagon drivers to halt! Hal, tell Raja to ready the younglings!" Without a word, they wheeled their horses and galloped. Gawain waited. That was Benji Dalfar's steel dust gelding, and as it came closer, Gawain could see Benji doubled over and clinging to the gelding's mane. The horse almost went past before Gawain could seize the reins. Benji turned his head without straightening, peered at Gawain with glazed eyes. There was blood around his mouth, and he had one arm tight against his middle as if trying to hold himself together. "You," he mumbled. "Thousands. All sides, I think." Suddenly he smiled. "Cold today, isn't it?" Blood gushed out of his mouth, and he toppled to the road, staring unblinking at the sun. Gawain spun his stallion around, galloping toward the wagons. There would be time for Benji later, if any of them were alive. Galena rode to meet him, linen dust cloak flaring behind her, dark eyes blazing fury in that serene face. She had been furious constantly since the day after Althor tried to escape. "Who do you think
Hey,
you
D-Man,
are,
how you
ordering the
doing,
wagons
bro?
stopped?" she demanded. "There are thousands of Aiel closing on us, Aes Sedai." He managed to keep his tone polite. The wagons were stopped at least, and the younglings forming up, but wagon drivers fingered their reins impatiently. Servants peered about fanning themselves. Aes Sedai chatted with warders. Galena's lips writhed contemptuously. You fool! No doubt those are the Shire.
Hell yeah,
Sylvana
D-man.
said she would give us an escort. But if you doubt, take your younglings and see for yourself. These wagons will keep moving toward Tavalen. It is time you learn that I give the orders here, not. And if they are not your tame Aiel. This was not the first time in the last few days that she had suggested he lead a scout himself. He suspected if he did, he would find Aiel and not tame. Whoever they are, they've killed one of my men. At least one. There were still 6 scouts out. Maybe you should consider the possibility these are Althor's Aiel. Come to rescue him. It will be too late when they start spitting us. It was only then that he realized he was shouting, but Galena's anger actually faded. She looked up the road to where Benji lay, then nodded slowly. Perhaps it would not
Which
be unwise
diamond
to
order are
be
you
cautious
doing
this once.
now, D-man?
Rand labored for breath. The air inside the chest felt thick and hot. Luckily, he could not smell it any longer. They sluiced him off with a bucket of water each night, but that was hardly a bath. And for a time, after they closed the lid on him each morning and latched it, the stench, added by yet another day exposed to the blast of the sun, assaulted his nose. Holding the void was an effort. He was a mass of stripes, not an inch of him, from shoulders to knees, but burned even before sweat touched it. And those 10,000 flames flickered on the borders of emptiness, trying to consume it. The half-healed wound in his side throbbed in the distance. The emptiness around him quivered.
Nice, D-man. I'm still working on that one 110 centimeter one.
Close. No. He could not waste time thinking about her. Even if she had followed, 6 Aes Sedai would not be able to free him. If they did not decide to join Galena. No trust. Never again trust for any Aes Sedai. Maybe he was imagining it anyway. Sometimes he did imagine things in here. Cool breezes, walking. Sometimes he lost thought of anything else.
30 by
hallucinated
30,
about walking
nice.
free. Just walking. Hours lost in what was important. He labored for breath, and he felt his way across the ice-slick barrier that divided him from the source. Again and again, fumbling to those 6 soft points. Soft. He could not stop. The fumbling was important. Dark, Lews Therin moaned in the depths of his head. No more dark. No more. Over and over again. Not too badly, though. Rand just ignored him this time. Suddenly he gasped. The chest was moving, grating loudly along the wagon bed. Was it night already?
Hey, Scott, how you doing?
Involuntarily. There would be another beating before he was fed, then doused with water and trussed like a goose to sleep however he could. But he would be out of the box. The darkness around him was incomplete, a deep dark gray. The tiny crack around the lid let in the smallest amount of light, though he could not see with his head jammed between his knees, and his eyes took as long each day to see anything but blackness as his nose did to grow deadened. Even so, it must be night. He could not help groaning as the chest tilted. There was no room for him to slide, but he shifted, putting new strains on muscles sore beyond sore. And the prison thumped to the ground hard. The lid would open soon. How many days in the broiling sun? How many nights? He had lost count. Which one would it be this time? Faces spun through his head. He had marked down every woman when she took her turn at him. They were a jumble now. Remembering which came where or when seemed beyond him. But he knew that Galena and Arian and Katarine had beaten him most often, the only ones to do so more than once. Those faces glowed in his mind with a feral light. How often did they want to hear him scream? Abruptly it came to him that the chest should have been opened by now. They intended to leave him in here all night, and then there would be tomorrow's sun, and muscles too bruised and sore to move managed a frantic heave. "Let me out!" he shouted hoarsely. Fingers scrabbled painfully behind his back, futilely. "Let me out!" he screamed. He thought he heard a woman laugh. For a time he wept, but then tears dried up in rage like a furnace. "Help me," he snarled at Bruce Theron. "Help me," the man groaned. "The light, help me." Muttering darkly, Rand returned to feeling blindly across that smooth plain to the 6 soft points. Sooner or later, they would let him out. Sooner or later, they would slacken their guard. When they did, he did not even know it when he began a rasping laugh. Crawling up the gentle slope on his belly, Perrin peered over the crest into a scene from the Dark One's dreams. The wolves had given him some notion of what to expect, but notions paled beside reality. Perhaps a mile from where he lay beneath the midday sun, a huge milling mass of Shido completely surrounded what seemed to be a ring of wagons and men centered on a small clump of trees not far from the road. A number of the wagons were bonfires, flames dancing. Balls of fire, small as a fist and large as boulders, hurtled into the Aiel. Gouts of fire flared, turning a dozen at a time to torches. Lightning fell from a cloudless sky, hurling earth and cotton-sore-clad figures into the air. But silver flashes of lightning struck at the wagons, too, and fire leaped from the Aiel. Much of that fire suddenly died or exploded short of any target. Many of the lightning bolts stopped abruptly. But if the battle seemed slightly in favor of the Aes Sedai, the sheer number of Shido had to prove overwhelming eventually. "There must be 200 or 300 women channeling down there, if not more." Karuna, lying beside him, sounded impressed. Soralea, beyond the Green Sister, certainly looked impressed. The Wise One smelled concerned, not afraid, but troubled. "I have never seen so many weaves at once," the Aes Sedai went on. "I think there are at least 30 sisters in the camp." "You have brought us to a boiling cauldron, young Ibarra." 40,000 Shido, Ruart muttered grimly on Perrin's other side. He even smelled grim. 40,000 at the least, and small satisfaction to know why they did not send more south. "The Lord Dragon is down there?" Dobrain asked, looking across Ruart. Perrin nodded. "And you mean to go in there and bring him out?" Perrin nodded again, and Dobrain sighed. He smelled resigned, not afraid. "We will go in, Lord Ibarra, but I do not believe we will come out." This time, Ruart nodded. Karuna looked at the men. "You do realize there are not enough of us? 9. Even if your Wise Ones can actually channel to any effect, we are not enough to match that." Soralea snorted loudly, but Karuna kept her eyes where they were. "Then turn around and ride south," Perrin told her. "I'll not let Elida have Rand." "Good," Karuna replied, smiling. "Because I will not either." He wished her smile did not make his skin crawl. Of course, had she seen the malevolent look Soralea directed at the back of her head, her skin might have crawled too. Perrin signaled to those at the bottom of the ridge, and Soralea and the Green slid down until they could straighten, and hurried in opposite directions. It was not much of a plan that they had. It boiled down to reaching Rand somehow, freeing him somehow, then hoping he was not injured too badly to make a gateway for as many as could to escape with him before either the Shido or the camp's Aes Sedai managed to kill them. Minor problems, no doubt, for a hero in a story or a gleeman's tale, but Perrin wished there had been time for some sort of real planning, not just what he and Dobrain and Ruark had hammered out with the clan chief running as fast as he could between their horses. Time was one of many things they did not have, though. No telling if the Tower Aes Sedai would be able to hold off the Shido for even another hour. First to move were the Two Rivers men and the Winged Guards, divided into 2 companies, one surrounding Wise Ones afoot, and the other mounted Aes Sedai and warders. To left and right, they crossed the ridge. Daniel had let them bring out the Red Eagle again, in addition to the Red Wolfhead. Ruart did not even glance toward where Amis walked, not far from Karuna's dark gelding, but Perrin heard him murmur, "May we see the sunrise together, shade of my heart." At the end, the Mayenners and Two Rivers men were to cover the wise ones in Aes Sedai in retreat, or maybe it would be the other way around. In either case, Bera and Karuna did not seem to like the plan. They very much wanted to be where Rand was. "Are you sure you will not ride, Lord Ibarra?" Dobrain asked from his saddle. To him, the notion of fighting on foot was anathema. Perrin patted the axe hanging at his hip. "This is not much use from horseback." It was, in truth, but he did not want to ride stepper or stayer into what lay ahead. Men could choose whether they threw themselves into the midst of steel and death. He chose for his horses, and today he chose no. "Maybe you'll lend me a stirrup when the time comes." Dobrain blinked. Karienin made little use of foot soldiers, but he seemed to understand and nodded. "It is time for the pipers to play the dance," Ruark said, lifting his black veil, though today there would be no pipers playing, which some of the Aiel did not like. Many of the maidens did not like the required strips of red cloth tied around their arms to distinguish them from Shido maidens for the Wetlanders. They seemed to think anyone should know at a glance. Black-veiled maidens and Siswayaman began trotting up the slope in a thick column, and Perrin walked with Dobrain to where Loyal already stood at the head of the Cairienin, gripping his axe in both hands and ears laid back. Aram was there too, afoot and his sword bare. The former tinker wore a dark smile of anticipation. Dobrain waved his arm for the advance, behind Rand's twin banners, and saddles creaked as a small forest of 500 lances climbed beside the Aiel. Nothing had changed in the battle, which surprised Perrin until he realized only moments had passed since he last saw it. The time had seemed longer. The great mass of Shido still pressed inward, wagons still burned, perhaps more than before. Lightning still struck from the sky, and fire leaped in balls and billows. The Two Rivers men were almost to their position, with the Mayenners and Aes Sedai and Wise Ones, moving almost unhurriedly across the rolling plain. Perrin would have held them farther back to give them a better chance at escape when the time came for that, but Daniel kept insisting they had to close to at least 300 paces for their bows to be effective, and Urella had been just as anxious not to hang back. Even the Aes Sedai, who Perrin was sure only had to be near enough to see clearly, had insisted. None of the Shido had looked around yet. At least, none were pointing at the threat moving slowly toward their backs. None were wheeling about to face it. All seemed fixed on rushing at the circle of wagons, falling back before fire and lightning, then rushing in again. All it would take would be one looking behind, but the inferno ahead held them. 800 paces, 700. The Two Rivers men dismounted, taking bows in hand. 600. 5. 4. Dobrain drew his sword, raised it high. "The Lord Dragon, Tiberwin, and victory!" he shouted, and the shout came from 500 throats as lances snapped down. Perrin had just time to seize hold of Dobrain's stirrup before the Cairienin were thundering forward. Loyal's long legs matched the horse's pace for pace. Loping along, letting the horse pull him in long leaping strides, Perrin sent his mind out. Come. Ground covered with brown grass, seemingly empty, suddenly gave birth to 1,000 wolves. Lean brown plains wolves, and some of their darker, heavier forest cousins, running low to hurl themselves into the backs of the Shido with snapping jaws, just as the first long Two Rivers shafts rained out of the sky beyond them. A second flight already arched high. New lightnings fell with the arrows, new fires bloomed. Veiled Shido, turning to fight wolves, had only moments to realize they were not the only threat, before a solid spear of Aiel stabbed into them alongside a hammer of Cairienin lances. Snatching his axe free, Perrin hacked down a Shido in his way and leaped over the man as he fell. They had to reach Rand. Everything rested on that. Beside him, Loyal's great axe rose and fell and swung, carving a path. Aram seemed to dance with his sword, laughing as he cut down everyone in his way. There was no time to think of anyone else. Perrin worked his axe methodically. He was hewing wood, not flesh. He tried not to see the blood that spurted, even when crimson sprayed his face. He had to reach Rand. He was slashing a path through brambles. All he focused on was the man in front of him. He thought of them as men, even when Height said it might be a maiden. He was not sure he could swing that red-dripping half-moon blade if he let himself think it was a woman he swung at. He focused, but other things drifted across his vision as he cut his way forward. A silvery lightning strike hurled cotton-sore-clad figures into the air, some wearing the scarlet headband, some not. Another bolt threw Dobrain from his horse. The Carianan labored to his feet, laying about him with his sword. Fire enveloped the knot of Carianan and Aiel, men and horses turning to screaming torches, for those who could still scream. These things passed before his eyes, but he did not let himself see them. There were only the men before him, the brambles, to be cleared by his axe and Loyal's, and Aram's sword. Then he saw something that pierced his concentration. A rearing horse, a toppling rider being pulled from his saddle as Aiel's spears stabbed him. A rider in a red breastplate. And there was another of the winged guards, and a clump of them thrusting their lances, with Norella's plume waving above his helmet. A moment later he saw Karuna, face serenely unconcerned, striding like a queen of battles along a path carved for her by 3 warders, and the fires that leaped from her own hands. And there was Vera, and farther over, Phaeldrin and Masuri, and what under the light were they all doing here? What were any of them doing? They were supposed to be back with the Wise Ones. From somewhere ahead came a hollow boom, like a thunderclap, cutting through the din of screams and shouts. A moment later, a slash of light appeared not 20 paces from him, slicing through several men and a horse like a huge razor as it widened into a gateway. A black-coated man with a sword jumped out of it and went down with a Shido spear through his middle. But a moment later, 8 or 9 more sprang through as the gateway vanished, forming a circle around the fallen man with their swords. With more than swords. Some of the Shido who rushed at them fell to a blade, but more simply burst into flame. Heads exploded like melons dropped onto stone from a height. Maybe 100 paces beyond them, Perrin thought he saw another circle of men in black coats, surrounded by fire and death, but he had no time to wonder. Shido were closing around him, too. Setting himself back to back with Loyal and Aram, he slashed and hacked desperately. There was no going forward now. It was all he could do to remain standing where he was. Blood pounded in his ears, and he could hear himself gasping for breath. He could hear Loyal, too, panting like a huge bellows. Perrin knocked aside a stabbing spear with his axe, slashed at another Aiel with a spike on the backswing, caught a spearhead with his hand, unmindful of the bloody gash it made, split a black-veiled face. He did not think they were going to last much longer. Every part of him centered on staying alive for 1 heartbeat more. Almost every part. One corner of his mind held an image of Aiel, and the sad thought that he would not be able to apologize for not coming back to her. Doubled painfully inside the chest, panting, Rand fumbled at the shield between him and the source. Moaning floated across the void, grim fury and burning fear slid along the edge of it. He was no longer altogether certain which was his and which Lews Therin's. Suddenly his breath froze. 6 points, but one was hard now, not soft, hard. And then a second, a third. Rasping laughter filled his ears. That was his, he realized after a moment. A 4th knot became hard. He waited, trying to stifle what sounded uncomfortably like deranged giggling. The last 2 points remained soft. Those muffled cackles died. They will feel it, Lews Therin groaned desperately. They will feel it and call the others back. Rand licked cracked lips with a tongue nearly as dry. All the moisture in him seemed to have gone into the sweat that slicked him and bit his welts. If he tried and failed, there would never be another chance. He could not wait. There might never be another chance anyway. Cautiously, blindly, he felt at the 4 hard points. There was nothing there, any more than the shield itself was anything he could feel or see. But somehow he could feel around this nothingness, feel a shape to it, like knots. There was always space between the cords in a knot, however tightly pulled. Gaps finer than a hair, where only air could go. Slowly, ever so slowly, he fumbled into one of those gaps, squeezing through infinitesimal spaces between what seemed not to be there at all. Slowly. How long before the others returned? If they took it up again before he found a way through this tortuous labyrinth? Slowly. And suddenly he could feel the source, like brushing it with a fingernail. The bare edge of a fingernail. Sayadine was still beyond him. The shield was still there, but he could feel hope welling in Luz Theron. Hope and trepidation. Two Aes Sedai were still holding their part of the barrier, still aware of what they held. Rand could not have explained what he did next, though Luz Theron had explained how. Explained between drifting off into his own mad fancies, between towering rages and wailing over his lost Ilyena, between gibbering that he deserved to die and shouting that he would not let them sever him. It was as if he flexed what he had extended through the knot, flexed it as hard as he could. The knot resisted. It trembled. And then it burst. There were only 5. The barrier thinned. He could feel it grow less. An invisible wall only 5 bricks thick now instead of 6. The two Aes Sedai would have felt it too, though they might not understand exactly what had happened or how. Please, light, not now, not yet. Quickly, almost frantically, he attacked the remaining knots in turn. A second went. The shield thinned. It was quicker now, quicker with each, as if he were learning the path through, though it was different each time. The third knot gone. And a third soft point appeared. Maybe the Aes Sedai did not know what he was doing, but they would not simply sit while the shield grew less and less. Truly frantic, Rand hurled himself at the 4th knot. He had to unravel it before a 4th sister came into the shield. 4 might be able to hold it, whatever he did. Almost weeping, he struggled through the complex windings, slipping between nothingness. Frenziedly, he flexed, bursting the knot. The shield remained, but held by only 3 now. If he could only move fast enough. When he reached for Sayadine, the invisible barrier was still there, but it no longer seemed stone or brick. It gave as he pressed, bending under his pressure. Bending, bending. Suddenly it tore apart before him like rotted cloth. The power filled him, and as it did, he seized at those 3 soft points, crushing them ruthlessly in fists of spirit. Aside from that, he still could only channel where he could see, and all he could see dimly was the inside of the chest, what he could glimpse of it with his head forced between his knees. Before he even finished with the fists of spirit, he channeled air. The chest exploded away from him with a loud boom. Free, Luz Theron breathed, and it was an echo of Rand's thought. Free. Or maybe the other way around. They will pay, Luz Theron growled. I am the Lord of Morning. Rand knew he had to move even more quickly now. Move quickly and violently. But at first he struggled to move at all. Muscles beaten twice a day for he did not know how long, crammed into a chest every day. Those muscles screamed as he gritted his teeth and slowly pushed up to hands and knees. It was a distant screaming. Someone else's body in pain, but he could not make that body move faster, however strong Sayadine made him feel. Emptiness buffered emotion, but something close to panic tried to wriggle creepers into the void. He was in a large clump of scattered trees with broad shafts of sunlight filtering through nearly leafless branches. He was shocked to realize it was still daylight, maybe even midday. He had to move. More Aes Sedai would be coming. 2 lay on the ground, apparently unconscious, one with a nasty gash bleeding across her forehead. The third, an angular woman, was on her knees staring at nothing, clutching her head in both hands and screaming. She seemed untouched by all the splinters and pieces of the chest. He did not recognize any of them. An instant of regret that it was not Galena or Arian he had stilled. He was not sure he had intended to do that. Luz Theron had gone on at length about how he intended to sever every one of them who had imprisoned him, and hoped it had been his own idea, however hasty. An instant, and he saw another shape stretched out on the ground beneath bits of the chest, in rose-colored coat and breeches. The angular woman did not look at him or stop shrieking even when he knocked her over against the low stone coping of a well as he crawled past. Desperately, he wondered why no one came to her screams. Halfway to Min, he became aware of lightning bolts lancing out of the sky and fireballs exploding overhead. He could smell wood burning, hear men shouting and screaming, the clash of metal, the cacophony of battle. He did not care if it was Tarmangaden. If he had killed Min. Gently, he turned her over. Big, dark eyes stared up at him. "Red," she breathed. "You're alive. I was afraid to look. There was an awful roar and pieces of wood everywhere. And I recognized part of the chest and..." Tears began spilling down her cheeks. "I thought they had... I was afraid you were..." Scrubbing at her face with bound hands, she drew a deep breath. Her ankles were bound, too. "Will you untie me, sheepherder, and make one of your gateways away from here? Or don't bother with untying, just toss me over your shoulder and go." Deftly, he wielded fire, parting the cords that held her. It isn't that simple, Min. He did not know this place at all. A gateway opened from here might go anywhere, if it opened at all. If he could open one at all. Pain and weariness shaved at the borders of the void. He was not sure how much of the power he could draw. Suddenly he realized he could feel Saidin being channeled in every direction. Through the trees, beyond burning wagons, he could see Aiel fighting warders and Gawain's green-coated soldiers, being driven back by Aes Sedai fire and lightning, yet coming on again. Somehow Taim had found him and brought Ashamon's soldiers and Aiel. "I cannot go just yet. I think some friends have come for me. Don't worry, I will protect you." A jagged silver blaze split a tree on the edge of the copse, close enough to make Rand's hair stir. Min gave a start. "Friends," she muttered, rubbing her wrists. He motioned her to stay where she was. Except for that one errant bolt, the thicket appeared untouched. But when he shoved himself to his feet, she was right there, holding him up on one side. Staggering to the sparse tree line, he was grateful for her support when he made himself straighten and stop leaning on her. How could she believe he would protect her if he needed her not to fall on his face? A hand on the shattered trunk of the lightning-struck tree helped. Tendrils of smoke rose from it, but it had not caught fire. The wagons made a great ring around the trees. Some of the servants seemed to be trying to keep the horses together. The teams were all still harnessed, but most huddled wherever they could in hope of avoiding the fury falling from above. In truth, except for that one bolt, it all seemed aimed at the wagons and men fighting. Maybe at the Aes Sedai, too. Each sat her horse a little way back from the whirl of spears and swords and flame, but not too far, sometimes standing in her stirrups for a better view. Rand spotted Arian quickly, slender and dark-haired on a pale gray mare. Luce Theron snarled, and Rand struck almost without thinking. He felt the other man's disappointment as he did. Spirit to shield her, with a resistance that told of slicing through her connection of Saidar. And even as that was tied, a club of air to knock her unconscious from the saddle. If he decided to still her, he wanted her to know who was doing it and why. One of the Aes Sedai shouted for someone to tend Arian, but no one looked toward the trees. No one out there could feel Saidin. They thought she had been felled by something from outside the wagons. His eyes searched among the other mounted women, stopped on Catherine, wheeling her long-legged bay gelding back and forth, fire blazing wherever she looked among the Aiel. Spirit in air, and she fell limply, one foot tangled in the stirrup. "Yes," Luce Theron laughed. "And now Galena. Her I want especially." Rand squeezed his eyes shut. What was he doing? It was Luce Theron who wanted those three so badly he could think of nothing else. Rand wanted to repay them for what they had done to him, but there was battle going on, men dying while he hunted for particular Aes Sedai. Maidens dying too, no doubt. He took the next Aes Sedai, 20 paces to Catherine's left with Spirit in air, then moved to another tree and put Serena Nemdal on the ground, unconscious and shielded. Slowly he staggered along the edge of the thicket, striking like a cutpurse time and again. Min stopped trying to hold him up, though her hands hovered, ready to catch him. "They're going to see us," she muttered. "One of them is going to look around and see us." "Galena," Luce Theron growled. "Where is she?" Rand ignored him. And men. Coirin fell, and 2 more whose names he did not know. He had to do what he could. The Aes Sedai had no way of telling what was happening. Steadily along the ring wall of wagons, sisters toppled from their horses. Those still conscious spread themselves out more, trying to cover the whole perimeter. An air of anxiety suddenly in the way they handled their horses, the redoubled fury with which fire blazed into the Aiel and lightning struck from the sky. It had to be something from outside, but Aes Sedai fell, and they did not know how or why. Their numbers dwindled, and the effects began to tell. Fewer lightning bolts fizzled abruptly in midair, and more struck among the warders and soldiers. Fewer balls of fire suddenly vanished or exploded before reaching the wagons. Aiel began pressing through the gaps between wagons. Wagons were heaved over. In moments, there were black-veiled Aiel everywhere, and chaos. Rand stared in amazement. Warders and green-coated soldiers fought in clumps against Aiel, and Aes Sedai surrounded themselves with rains of fire. But there were Aiel fighting Aiel as well. Men with the scarlet Siswayamon headband, and maidens with red strips tied to their arms fighting Aiel without. And Carian and Lancers in their bell-shaped helmets, and Mayenners in red breastplates were suddenly among the wagons too, striking at Aiel as well as warders. Had he finally gone mad? He was conscious of Min pressed against his back and trembling. She was real. What he was seeing must be real. A dozen or so Aielmen, each as tall as he or taller, started trotting toward him. They wore no red. He watched them curiously until, within a pace of him, one raised a reversed spear like a cudgel. Rand channeled, and fire seemed to shoot out of a dozen everywhere. Charred and bodies tumbled at his feet. Suddenly, Gawain was reining a bay stallion up not 10 paces in front of him, sword in hand, and 20 or more green-coated men riding at his heels. For a moment, they stared at one another, and Rand prayed he would not have to harm Elaine's brother. "Min!" Gawain grated. "I can take you out of here." She peeked past Rand's shoulder to shake her head. She was holding on to him so tightly he did not think he could have pried her loose. "I'm staying with him, Gawain. Gawain, Elaine loves him." With the power in him, Rand could see the man's knuckles go white on his sword hilt. "Jasao," he said in a flat voice. "Rally the younglings. We are cutting away out of here." If his voice had been flat before, now it went dead. "Althor, one day I will see you die." Digging his heels in, he galloped away, he and all the others shouting, "Younglings!" at the top of their lungs, and more men in green coats cutting away to join them with every stride. A man in a black coat darted in front of Rand, staring after Gawain, and the ground erupted in a gout of fire and earth that toppled half a dozen horses as they reached the wagons. Rand saw Gawain sway in the saddle in the instant before he beat the black-coated man to the ground with a mace of air. He did not know the hard-faced young man who snarled at him, but the fellow wore both the sword and dragon on his high collar, and Saladin filled him. In an instant, it seemed, Taim was there. Blue and gold dragons twined around the sleeves of his black coat, staring down at the fellow. His collar bore neither pin. "You would not strike at the dragon reborn, Gedwin," Taim said, at once soft and steely, and the hard-faced man scrambled to his feet, saluting with fist to heart. Rand looked toward where Gawain had been, but all he could see was a large group of men with a white boar banner slashing their way deeper into the surrounding Aiel, with more green-coated men fighting to join them. Taim turned to Rand, that almost smile on his lips. "Under the circumstances, I trust you will not hold it against me, violating your command about confronting Aes Sedai. I had reason to visit you in Carian, and..." He shrugged. "You look the worse for wear. You will allow me to..." The slight twist of his lips flattened as Rand stepped back from his outstretched hand, pulling Min with him. She hung on tighter than ever. Lews Therin had begun ranting about killing as he always did when Taim appeared, rambling madly about the Forsaken and killing everybody. But Rand stopped listening, walled the man off to the buzzing of a fly. It was a trick he had learned inside the chest, when there was nothing to do but feel at the shield and listen to a voice in his head that was insane more often than not. Yet even without Lews Therin, he did not want to be healed by the man. He thought if Taim ever touched him with the power, however innocently, he would kill him. "As you wish," the hawk-nosed man said wryly. I have the campsite secured, I believe. That seemed true enough. Bodies littered the ground, but in only a few places did men still fight inside the ring of wagons. A dome of air suddenly covered the entire camp, smoke from the fires sliding up to a hole left in the top. It was not one solid weave of sardine. Rand could see where individual weaves butted one against another to make it. You thought there might have been as many as 200 black-coated men beneath the dome. A hail of lightning and fire struck that barrier and exploded harmlessly. The sky itself seemed to crackle and burn. The constant roar of it filled the air. Maidens with strips of red dangling from their arms and Siswayaman stood along the wall they could not see, mingled with Mayeners and Karienin, many of them afoot as well. On the other side, a solid mass of Shido stared at the invisible barricade, keeping them from their enemies, sometimes stabbing at it with spears or hurling themselves against it bodily. Spears stopped short, and bodies bounced back. Inside the dome, the last fighting died, even as Rand looked. Under the eyes of a scant handful of red-marked men and maidens, disarmed Shido were removing their garments with stolid faces. Taken in battle, they would wear Gaishan white for a year and a day, even if the Shido somehow succeeded in overrunning the camp. Karienin and Mayeners provided guards for a large knot of angry warders and younglings mixed with fearful servants, almost as many guards as prisoners. Nearly a dozen Aes Sedai were being shielded by an equal number of Ashaman, wearing sword and dragon. The Aes Sedai looked sick and frightened. Rand recognized 3, though Nakin was the only one he could name. He did not recognize any of their Ashaman jailers. A number of the women Rand had shielded and rendered unconscious were laid out with those prisoners, some of them beginning to stir, while black-coated soldiers and dedicated, with the silver sword in their collars, were using sardine to drag others across the ground and lay them in that row. Some of them brought the 2 unconscious Aes Sedai and the angular woman out of the copse. She was still screaming. When they were added to the cluster, some of the Aes Sedai abruptly turned away and vomited. There were other Aes Sedai present, surrounded by warders and watched by black-coated men, though not shielded, watching the Ashaman as uneasily as did the women under guard. They stared at Rand, too, and plainly would have come to him if not for the Ashaman. Rand glared back. Ilana was there. He had not been hallucinating. He did not recognize all of her companions, but enough. There were 9 altogether. 9. Sudden rage stormed outside the void, and Lews Theron's fly buzz grew louder. At that point, it seemed no surprise at all to see Perrin stagger up, face and beard bloody, followed by a limping Loyal with a huge axe, and a bright-eyed fellow who looked at Tinker in a red-striped coat, except for the sword he carried, blade crimson from end to end. Rand almost looked around to see whether Matt was also there somehow. He did see Dobrain, on foot with a sword in one hand and the sap of Rand's crimson banner in the other. Nandera joined Perrin, letting her veil drop, and another maiden Rand almost did not recognize at first. It was good to see Sulin and Kaden Sor once more. "Rand," Perrin gasped. "Thank the light you're still alive. We meant for you to make a gateway for us to escape, but it's all fallen to pieces. Ruark and most of the Aiel are still out among the Shido. Most of the Mayeners and Karienin, too. And I don't know what has happened to the 2 Rivers folk, or the Wise Ones. The Aes Sedai were supposed to stay with them, but..." Putting the head of his axe on the ground, he leaned on the shaft, panting. He looked as if he might fall without the support. Along the barrier, mounted men were appearing, as well as Aielmen in red headbands and maidens with strips of red dangling from their arms. The barrier held them out as well. Wherever they appeared, Shido swarmed over them, swallowed them up. "Let the dome go," Rand ordered. Perrin sighed in relief, of all things. Had he thought Rand would let his own people be slaughtered? But Loyal sighed, too. Right, what did they think of him? Min began rubbing his back, murmuring under her breath in a soothing tone. For some reason, Perrin gave her a very surprised look. Taim might have been surprised, but he was certainly not relieved. "My Lord Dragon," he said in a tight voice. I would say there are still several hundred Shido women out there, some not insignificant, it seems. And that is not to mention some thousands of Shido with spears. Unless you truly want to find out whether you are immortal, I suggest waiting a few hours until we know this place well enough to make gateways with some certainty where they will come out. Then leaving. There are casualties in battle. I lost several soldiers today. 9 men who will be harder to replace than any number of Renegade Aiel. Whoever dies out there dies for the Dragon Reborn. If he had been paying any attention to Nandera or Sulin, he might have moderated his tone and chosen his words more carefully. Hand talk flashed between them. They looked ready to strike him down on the spot. Perrin pushed himself upright, yellow eyes fixed on Rand, firm and anxious at the same time. Rand. Even if Daniel and the Wise Ones held back the way they were supposed to, they'll not leave as long as they see this. He gestured to the dome overhead, where fire and lightning made a continuous sheet of light. If we sit here for hours, the Shido will turn on them sooner or later, if they haven't already. Light, Rand. Daniel and Ban and Will and Tell. Amis is out there, and Soralia, and... Burn you, Rand. More have died for you already than you know. Perrin drew a deep breath. At least let me out. If I can make it that far, I can let them know that you're alive, and they can retreat before they get killed. 2 of us can slip out, Loyal said quietly, after a few jacks. 2 will stand a better chance. The tinker only smiled, but almost eagerly. I will have a place opened in the barrier, Taim began, but Rand broke in on him sharply. No! The 2 Rivers folk. He could not appear to worry over them any more than over the Wise Ones. Truth to tell, he had to seem to worry less. Amis was out there? The Wise Ones never took part in battle. They walked untouched through battles and blood feuds. They had ripped apart country, if not law, to come for him. He would as soon let Perrin go back into the mansion as abandon him. It could not be for the Wise Ones or the 2 Rivers folk.
Cheers, Chris.
Savannah wants my head, Taim. Apparently, she thought she could take it today. The emotionless quality the void gave to his voice was appropriate. It did seem to worry Min, though. She was stroking his back as though to calm him. I mean to let her know her mistake. I told you to make weapons, Taim. Show me just how deadly they are. Disperse the Shido. Break them. As you command. If Taim had been still before, he was stone now. Put my standard up where they can see it, Rand commanded. At least that would tell everyone outside who held the camp. Maybe the Wise Ones and 2 Rivers folk would pull back when they saw that. Loyal's ears wriggled uneasily, and Perrin grabbed Rand's arm as Taim walked away. I saw what they do, Rand. It's... With his bloody face and bloody axe, he disgusted. What the hell do I do? Rand demanded. What else can I do? Perrin's hand fell away, and he sighed. I do not know. I do not have to like it, though. Grady, raise the banner of light, Taim called, and the power made his voice boom. On flows of air, Jer Grady lifted the crimson banner out of a surprised Dobrain's hand and raised it all the way through the hole in the top of the dome. Fire burst around it, and lightning flashed as brilliant red, lifted the smoke billowing up from the burning wagons. Rand recognized a number of the men in black coats, but he knew only a few names aside from Jer's. Damer and Fedwin and Eben, Jahar and Torville. Of those, only Torville wore the dragon on his collar. Ashaman, form line of battle, Taim boomed. Black-coated men rushed to place themselves between the barrier and everyone else. All of them except Jer and those watching Aes Sedai. Except for Nesun, who peered intently at everything, the tower lot had sunk listlessly to their knees, not even looking at the men who had them shielded. And even Nesun still wasn't sticking up. The Salagar group stared coldly at the Ashaman guarding them for the most part, though now and then they turned those icy eyes on Rand. Alana stared only at Rand. His skin was tingled faintly, he realized. For him to feel it at that distance, all 9 must be embracing Saidar. He hoped they had enough sense not to channel. The stony man facing them held Saidin to bursting, and they looked as tense as the warder's finger on their shoulder.
Ashaman, raise the barricade 2 spans.
At Taim's command, the edges of the dome rose all around. Surprised Shido, who had been pushing at what they could not see, stumbled forward. They recovered instantly, a black-veiled mass surging forward. But they had time for only a stride before Taim's next shout.
Ashaman, kill!
The front rank of Shido exploded. There was no other way to put it. Caught in sword-clad shapes burst apart in sprays of blood and flesh. Blows of Saidin reached through that thick mist, darting from figure to figure in the blink of an eye. And the next row of Shido died, then the next, and the next, as though they were running into an enormous meat grinder. Staring at the slaughter, Rand swallowed. Perrin bent over to empty his stomach, and Rand understood fully. Another rank died. Then Dara put a hand over her eyes, and Sulin turned her back. The bloody ruins of human beings began to make a wall. No one could stand up to that. Between one blast of death and the next, the Shido in front were suddenly struggling the other way, forcing themselves back into the mass, fighting to get forward. The milling tangle itself began to explode. And then all of them were falling back. No, running. The rain of fire and lightning against the dome faltered.
Ashaman,
Taim spoke.
rolling ring of earth and fire.
Beneath the feet of the Shido nearest the wagons, the ground suddenly erupted in fountains of flame and dirt, hurling men in every direction. While bodies still hung in the air, more gouts of flame roared from the ground, and more, in an expanding ring all the way around the wagons, pursuing the Shido for 50 paces, 100, 200. There was nothing but panic and death out there now. Spears and bucklers were cast aside. The dome above stood clear, except for the smoke rising from the burning wagons.
Stop!
The roar of explosions swallowed Rand's shout, as well as it did men's screams. He wove the flows Taim had used.
Stop it, Taim!
His voice crashed like thunder over everything. One more ring of eruptions, and Taim called,
Ashaman, rest!
For a moment, a deafening silence seemed to fill the air. Rand's ears rang. Then he could hear screams and moans. Wounded heaved among the piles of dead. And beyond them, the Shido ran, leaving behind scattered clusters of Siswayaman and maidens with red arm cloths, Karienin and Mayenners, some still in their horses. Almost hesitantly, those began to move forward toward the wagons, some of the Aiel lowering their veils. With power enhancing his eyes, he could make out Ruark, limping, one arm dangling, but on his feet. And well beyond him, a large group of women in dark, bulky skirts and pale blouses, with an escort of men in 2 Rivers coats carrying longbows. They were too far for him to make out faces, but from the way the 2 Rivers men at least were staring at the fleeing Shido, they were as stunned as anyone else. A great sense of relief welled up inside Rand, though not enough to still the distant churning in his stomach. Min had her face pressed against his shirt. She was weeping. He smoothed her hair. Asha. He had never been more glad of the void draining emotion from his voice. You have done well. I congratulate you, Taim. He turned away, so he would not have to see the carnage anymore, hardly hearing the cheers of Lord Dragon and Ashaman that thundered from the black-coated men. When he turned, he found Aes Sedai. Arana was all the way at the back, but Alana stood almost face-to-face with him, beside 2 Aes Sedai he did not recognize. You have done well, the square-faced one of the pair said. A farmer with an ageless face and eyes just holding on to serenity, ignoring the Ashaman around her, obviously ignoring them. I am Vera Harkin, and this is Karuna Nachiman. We came to rescue you with Ilana's aid. That was an obvious addition at Ilana's sudden frown. Though it seems you had small need of us, still intentions do count, and your place is with them, Rand said, pointing to the Aes Sedai shielded and under guard. 23, he saw, and Galena not among them. The buzzing of loose theron swelled, but he refused to listen. Now was no time for insane rages. Karuna drew herself up proudly. Whatever she was certainly no farmer. You forget who we are. They may have mistreated you, but we... I've nothing, Aes Sedai, Rand said coldly. I said 6 could come, but I count 9. I said you would be on an equal footing with the Tower emissaries, and for bringing 9 you will be. They are on their knees, Aes Sedai. Kneel. Coldly serene faces stared back at him. He felt Ashaman readying shields of spirit. Defiance grew on Karuna's face, on Vera's, on others. 24 black-coated men made a ring around Rand and the Aes Sedai. Taim appeared as close to a smile as Rand had ever seen him. Kneel and swear to the Lord Dragon, he said softly, or you will be knelt. As stories do, the tale spread across Kyrian and north and south, by merchant train and peddler and simple traveler gossiping at an inn. As stories do, the tale changed with every telling. The Aiel had turned on the Dragon Reborn and killed him at Dumai's Wells or elsewhere. No, the Aes Sedai had saved Rand al'Thor. It was Aes Sedai who had killed him. No. Gentled him. No. Carried him to Tarvalon, where he languished in a dungeon beneath the White Tower. Or else where the Amelan Seat herself knelt to him. Unusually for stories, it was something very close to truth that was most often believed. On a day of fire and blood, a tattered banner waved above Dumai's Wells, bearing the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai. On a day of fire and blood and the one power, as prophecy had suggested, the unstained tower broken, bent knee to the forgotten sign. The first 9 Aes Sedai swore fealty to the Dragon Reborn, and the world was changed forever.
Epilogue. The answer. The man only paused long enough to rest his hand on the door of the sedan chair, and was away as soon as Phaleon took the note from his fingers. Her rap had the 2 bearers moving almost before the fellow in Tarasan Palace livery stepped back into the crowd of the square. There was only one word on the small square of paper. Gone. She crumpled it in her fist. Somehow they had slipped out again without her people inside seeing. Months of futile search had convinced her there was no cache of Angreal, whatever Moghedien believed. She'd even considered putting a wise woman or 2 to the question. One of them might know its whereabouts, if it existed, and horses might fly. All that kept her here in this wretched city was the simple fact that when one of the Chosen gave a command, you obeyed until it was changed. Anything else was a short road to a painful death. Yet if Elaine and Nynaeve were here, they had ruined everything in Tanchico. Whether or not they really were full sisters, impossible as that seemed, Phaleon would not take their presence as coincidence. Maybe there was a cache. For the first time, she was glad that Moghedien had ignored her since giving her her orders so many months ago in Amadisia. What had felt like abandonment might yet be a chance for advancement in the Chosen's eyes. That pair might yet lead her to the cache, and if not, if there was no cache, Moghedien had seemed to have some interest in Elaine and Nynaeve themselves. Delivering them would certainly be better than non-existent Angreal. Leaning back, she let the sway of the chair soothe her. She did hate this city. She had come here as a runaway when she was a novice, but perhaps this visit would end pleasantly after all.
Sitting in his study, Herod was peering into his pipe and wondering whether he had the means of lighting it at hand, when the golem squeezed under the door. Of course, even if Pell had been paying attention, he would not have believed, and once the golem was inside the room, few men would have stood any chance. When Adrian came to Fell's study later, she stared at what was piled none too neatly on the floor beside the table. It took her a moment to realize what it was, and when she did, she fainted before she could get a scream out. However many times she heard of someone torn limb from limb, she had never seen it before. The rider turned his horse at the top of the hill for a last look back at Ebudar, gleaming white in the sun. A good city for looting, and from what he had learned of the local people, they would resist. So the blood would allow looting. They would resist, but he hoped the other eyes were bringing back reports of disunity such as he had seen. Resistance would not last long, or a so-called queen ruled a tiny patch of ground, and that combined the best possibilities. Wheeling his mount, he rode west. Who knew? Perhaps that fellow's comment had been an omen. Perhaps the return would come soon, and the daughter of the 9 moons with it. Surely that would be the greatest omen of victory.
Be right back.
Lying on her back in the night, Moghedien stared at the roof of the tiny tent she was allowed to herself as one of the Amerlin's servants. From time to time, her teeth ground, but as soon as she realized it, she stilled them again, very conscious of the Idam necklace tight around her neck. This Egwene Alvir was harder than Elaine or Nynaeve had been. She tolerated less and demanded more, and when she passed the bracelet to Swan or Lyanna, especially Swan, Moghedien shivered. That must be what it would be like if Brigitte could wear the bracelet. The tent flap moved aside, admitting just enough moonlight for her to make out a woman ducking in. "Who are you?" Moghedien demanded roughly. When they sent for her in the night, whoever came always brought a lantern. "Call me Arangar, Moghedien," an amused voice said, and a small light bloomed inside the tent. Her own name clove Moghedien's tongue to the roof of her mouth. That name meant death here. She was struggling to speak, to say her name was Marigan, when suddenly she became truly aware of the light. A small glowing white ball, pale, hanging in the air near her head. With the Idam on her, she could not do more than think of Saidar without permission, but she could still feel it channeled, see the webs woven. This time she felt nothing, saw nothing, just a tiny ball of pure light. She stared at the woman who had called herself Arangar, recognizing her now. Halima, she thought, secretary to one of the sitters, she believed, but a woman certainly, if one who looked as though she had been designed by a man. A woman, but that ball of light had to be Saidin. "Who are you?" Her voice shook slightly, and she was surprised it was so steady. The woman smiled at her, a very amused smile, as she settled beside the pallet. "I told you, Moghedien. My name is Arangar. You will learn that name in the future if you are lucky. Now listen to me carefully. Ask no more questions. I will tell you what you need to know. In a moment I will remove your pretty necklace. When I do, you will vanish as quickly and silently as Loghain did. If you do not, you will die here. And that will be a shame, because you are summoned to Sheol Ghul this very night." Moghedien licked her lips. Summoned to Sheol Ghul. That could mean eternity in the pit of doom, or immortality ruling the world, or anything in between. Little chance it meant being named nameless, not if the great lord knew enough of how she had spent the past months to send someone to free her. Yet it was a summons she could not refuse, and it meant an end to the Idam at last. "Yes, remove it. I will go immediately." There was no point to delaying anyway. She was stronger than any woman in the camp, but she did not intend to give a circle of 13 a chance at her. I thought you would see it so. Halima, or Arangar, chuckled richly. She touched the necklace, flinching slightly, and Mogedion wondered again about a woman who apparently channeled Sidene and was hurt, however faintly, by touching what should only hurt a man who could channel. Then the necklace was off, being slipped hastily into the woman's pouch. Go, Mogedion. Go now. When Egwene reached the tent and put her head and lantern in, she found only disturbed blankets. She withdrew slowly. Mother, Chesa fussed behind her, you should not be out in the night air. Night air is bad air. If you wanted Marigan, I could have fetched her. Egwene looked around. She had felt the necklace come off, and felt the flash of pain that meant a man who could channel had brushed the link. Most people were already asleep, but a few still sat outside their tents around low fires, and some not far. It might be possible to find out which man had come to Marigan's tent. I think she has run away, Chesa, she said. Chesa's angry mutterings about women who deserted their mistresses followed her back to her own tent. It could not have been Loghain, could it? He would not have come back, could not have known. Could he?
Demandred knelt in the pit of doom, and for once he did not care that Shaida Haran watched his trembling with that eyeless, impassive gaze. Have I not done well, great lord? The great lord's laughter filled Demandred's head.
The unstained tower breaks and bends knee to the forgotten sign. The seas rage and storm clouds gather unseen. Beyond the horizon, hidden fires swell, and serpents nestle in the bosom. What was exalted is cast down. What was cast down is raised up. Order burns to clear his path. The Prophecies of the Dragon. Translation by Georad Manyard, Governor of the Province of Andor, for the High King, Arter Peyendrag Tanriel. The end of the 6th book of the Wheel of Time.
Aye, it's a bad thing to displeasure the gentry, sure enough. They can be unfriendly if they're angered, and they can be the very best of good neighbours if they're treated kindly. My mother's sister was alone in the house one day, with a big pot of water boiling on the fire, and ane of the wee folk fell down the chimney, and slipped with his leg in the hot water. He let a terrible squeal out of him, and in a minute the house was full of wee craters pulling him out of the pot and carrying him across the floor. Did she scold you? My aunt heard them saying to him. Na, na, 'twas myself scalded my own self, quoth the wee. A wheel, says they. If it was your own self scalded yourself, we'll say nothing. But if she had scalded you, we'd ha' made her pay. The trooping fairies. Changelings. Sometimes the fairies fancy mortals and carry them away into their own country, leaving instead some sickly fairy child, or a log of wood so bewitched that it seems to be immortal, pining away and dying and being buried. Most commonly they steal children. If you overlook a child, that is, look on it with envy, the fairies have it in their power. Many things can be done to find out in a child a changeling, but there is one infallible thing. Lay it on the fire.
My ancestors. For centuries, its lofty battlements have frowned down upon the wild and rugged countryside about, serving as a home and stronghold for the proud house whose honoured line is older even than the moss-grown castle walls. These ancient turrets, stained by the storms of generations and crumbling under the slow yet
This is Audible.
Prologue. Lightnings. From the tall arched window. Prologue. Gray skies to bow. Pray that the heart of Audio Renaissance presents A Crown of Swords, Book 7.
Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, But 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastnesses of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from the sky, which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock, which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound
We'll be right
and
back,
looked
everyone.
down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual, urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze. I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously representing marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dorian. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination.
The male half of the one power. The room he stood in with warm means. Renaud Fanoir sat on his porch, warming the sturdy black oak chair crafted for him by his grandson 2 years before. He stared northward, at the black and silver clouds. He'd never seen their like before. They blanketed the entire horizon to the north, high in the sky. They weren't gray, they were black and silver. Dark, rumbling thunderheads, as dark as a root cellar at midnight, with striking silver light breaking between them, flashes of lightning that gave off no sound. The air was thick with the sense of dust and dirt, of dried leaves and rain that refused to fall. Spring had come, and yet his crops didn't grow. Not a sprout had dared poke through the earth. He rose slowly from his chair, wood creaking, chair rocking softly behind him, and walked up to the edge of the porch. He chewed on his pipe, though its fire had gone out. He couldn't be bothered to relight it. Those clouds transfixed him. They were so black, like the smoke of a brush fire, only no brush fire smoke ever rose that high up in the air. And what to make of silver clouds, bulging between the black ones, like places where polished steel shone metal crusted with soot. He rubbed his chin, glancing down the yard. A small whitewashed field contained a patch of grass and shrubs. The shrubs were dead now, every one of them. They lasted through that winter. He'd need to pull them out soon. And the grass, well, the grass was still just winter thatch. Not even any weeds sprouted. A clap of thunder shook him, pure, sharp, like an enormous crash of metal against metal. Rattled the windows of the house, shook the porch boards, seemed to vibrate his very bones. He jumped back. That strike had been close, perhaps on his property. He itched to go inspect the damage. Lightning fire could destroy a man, burn him out of his land. Up here in the borderlands, so many things were unintentional tinder. Dry grass, dry shingles, dry seed. But the clouds were still distant. That strike couldn't have been on his property. The silver and black thunderheads rolled and boiled, feeding and consuming themselves. He closed his eyes, calming himself, taking a deep breath. Had he imagined the thunder? Was he going off the side, as Gaffin always joked? He opened his eyes, and the clouds were right there, directly above his house. It was as if they had suddenly rolled forward, intending to strike while his gaze was averted. They dominated the sky now, sweeping distantly in either direction, massive and overwhelming. He could almost feel their weight pressing the air down around him. He drew in a breath that was heavy with sudden humidity, and his brow prickled with sweat. Those clouds churned, dark black and silver thunderheads shaking with white blasts. They suddenly boiled downward, like the funnel cloud of a twister coming for him. He cried out, raising a hand, as a man might before a powerfully bright light. That blackness, that endless, suffocating blackness, it would take him. He knew. And then the clouds were gone. His pipe hit the porch floorboards, clicking softly, tossing burnt tobacco out in a spray across the steps. He hadn't realized he'd let it slip free. Renaud hesitated, looking up at empty blue sky, realizing that he was cringing at nothing. The clouds were off on the horizon again, some 40 leagues distant. They thundered softly. He picked up his pipe with a shaking hand, spotted from age, tanned from years spent in the sun. Just a trick of your mind, Renaud, he told himself. You're going off the side, sure as eggs is eggs. He was on edge because of the crops. That had him on edge. Though he spoke optimistic words for the lads, it just wasn't natural. Something should have sprouted by now. He'd farmed that land for 40 years. Barley didn't take this long to sprout. Burn him, but it didn't. What was going on in the world these days? Plants couldn't be depended on to sprout, and clouds didn't stay where they should. He forced himself to sit back down in his chair. Getting old, he thought. He'd worked a farm all of his life. Farmsteading was not easy, but if you worked hard, you could grow a successful life while you grew strong crops. A man has as much luck as he has seeds in the field, his father had always said. Well, Renaud was one of the most successful farmers in the area. He'd done well enough to buy out the 2 farms beside his, and he could run 30 wagons to market each fall. He now had 6 good men working for him, plowing the fields, riding the fences. Not that he didn't have to climb down in the muck every day and show them what good farming was all about. You couldn't let a little success ruin you. Yes, he'd worked the land, lived the land, as his father always used to say. He understood the weather as well as a man could. Those clouds weren't natural. They rumbled softly, like an animal growling on a dark night, waiting, lurking in the nearby woods. He jumped at another cloud that seemed too close. Those clouds 40 leagues away? Is that what he'd thought? Looked more like 10 leagues away, now that he studied them. Don't get like that, he grumbled at himself. His own voice sounded good to him, real. It was nice to hear something other than that rumbling and the occasional creak of shutters in the wind. Shouldn't he be able to hear Ah Wang inside getting supper ready? You're tired. That's it. Tired. He fished in his vest pocket and pulled out his tobacco pouch. A faint rumbling came from the right. At first he assumed it was the thunder. However, this rumbling was too grating, too regular. That wasn't thunder, it was wheels turning. Sure enough, a large, oxen-drawn wagon crested Mallard's Hill just to the east. Renaud had named that hill himself. Every good hill needed a name. The road was Mallard's Road, so why not name the hill that too? He leaned forward in his chair, pointedly ignoring those clouds as he squinted toward the wagon, trying to make out the driver's face. Thulin? The smith? What was he doing driving a wagon laden halfway to the heavens? He was supposed to be working on Renaud's new car. Lean for one of his trade, Thulin was still twice as muscled as most farmhands. He had the dark hair and tan skin of a Shinaran, and kept his face shaved after their fashion, but he did not wear the topknot. Thulin's family might trace its roots back to borderland warriors, but he himself was just a simple countryman like the rest of them. He ran the smithy over in Oakwater, 5 miles to the east. Renaud had enjoyed many a game of stones with the smith during winter evenings. Thulin was getting on. He hadn't seen as many years as Renaud, but the last few winters had prompted Thulin to start speaking of retirement. Smithing wasn't an old man's trade.
Be right back,
of course not, it was farming. Were there really any old man's trades? Thulin's wagon approached along the packed earthen road, approaching Renaud's white-fenced yard. Now that's odd, Renaud thought. Behind the wagon trailed a neat string of animals. 5 goats and 2 milk cows. Crates of black-feathered chickens were tied on the outside of the wagon, and the bed of the wagon itself was piled full of furniture, sacks, and barrels. Thulin's youthful daughter, Mirala, sat on the seat with him next to his wife, a golden-haired woman from the south. 25 years Thulin's wife, but Renaud still thought of Delanha as that southern girl. The whole family was in the wagon, leading their best livestock, obviously on the move. But where? Off to visit relatives, perhaps? He and Thulin hadn't played a round of stones in, 3 weeks now. Not much time for visiting, what with the coming of spring and the hurried planting. Someone would need to mend the plows and sharpen the scythes. Who would do it if Thulin's smithy went cold? Renaud tucked a pinch of tobacco into his pipe as Thulin pulled the wagon up beside Renaud's yard. The lean, gray-haired smith handed the reins to his daughter, then climbed down from the wagon, feet throwing puffs of dust into the air when he hit the ground. Behind him, the distant storm still brewed. Thulin pushed open the fence gate, then strode up to the porch. He looked distracted. Renaud opened his mouth to give greeting, but Thulin spoke first. I buried my best anvil in Delanha's old strawberry patch, Renaud, the big smith said. You remember where that is, don't you? I packed my best set of tools there as well. They're well greased and inside my best chest, lined to keep it dry. That should keep the rust off of them, for a time at least. Renaud closed his mouth, holding his pipe half full. If Thulin was burying his anvil, Well, it meant he wasn't planning to come back for a while. Thulin, what? If I don't return, Thulin said, glancing northward, would you dig my things out and see that they're cared for? Sell them to someone who cares, Renaud. I wouldn't have just anyone beating that anvil. Took me 20 years to gather those tools, you know. But, Thulin, Renaud sputtered, where are you going? Thulin turned back to him, leaning one arm on the porch railing, those brown eyes of his solemn. There's a storm coming, he said, and so I figure I've got to head on to the north. Storm? Renaud asked. That one on the horizon, you mean? Thulin, it looks bad. Burn my bones, but it does. But there's no use running from it. We've had bad storms before. Not like this, old friend, Thulin said. This ain't the sort of storm you ignore. Thulin? Renaud asked. What are you talking about? Before he could answer, Galanha called from the wagon box. Did you tell him about the pots? Ah, Thulin said. Galanha polished up that set of copper-bottom pots that your wife always liked. They're sitting on the kitchen table waiting for Owain if she wants to go claim them. With that, Thulin nodded to Renaud and began to walk back toward the wagon. Renaud sat, stupefied. Thulin always had been a blunt one. He favored saying his mind, then moving on. That was part of what Renaud liked about him. But the smith could also pass through a conversation like a boulder rolling through a flock of sheep, leaving everyone dazed. Renaud scrambled up, leaving his pipe on the chair, and following Thulin down into the yard into the wagon. Burn it? Renaud thought, glancing to the sides, noticing the brown grass and dead shrubs again. He'd worked hard on that yard. The smith was checking on the chicken crates tied to the sides of his vehicle. Renaud caught up to him, reaching out a hand, but Galanha had distracted him. Here, Renaud, she said from the wagon box. Take these. She held out a basket of eggs, one lock of golden hair straying from her bun. Renaud reached over to take the basket. Give these to Owain. I know you're short on chickens on account of those foxes last fall. Renaud took the basket of eggs. Some were white, some were brown. Yes, but where are you going, Galanha? North, my friend, Thulin said. He walked past, laying a hand on Renaud's shoulder. There will be an army gathering, I figure. They'll need smiths. Please, Renaud said, gesturing with the basket of eggs. At least take a few minutes. Owain just put some bread in. One of those thick honey loaves that you like. We can discuss this over a game of stones. Thulin hesitated. We'd better get on the move, Galanha said softly. That storm is coming. Thulin nodded, then climbed up into the wagon. You might want to come north too, Renaud. If you do, bring everything you can. He paused. You're good enough with the tools you have here to do some small metal work, so take your best scythes and turn them into pole arms. Your two best scythes. Now don't go skimping around with anything that's a second best or a third best. Get your best, because it's the weapon you're going to use. Renaud frowned. How do you know that there will be an army? Thulin, burn me, I'm no soldier. Thulin continued as if he hadn't heard the comments. With a pole arm, you can pull somebody off of a horse and stab them. And as I think about it, maybe you can take the third best and make yourself a couple of swords. What do I know about making a sword? Or about using a sword, for that matter? You can learn, Thulin said, turning north. Everyone will be needed, Renaud. Everyone. They're coming for us. He glanced back at Renaud. A sword really isn't all that tough to make. You take a scythe blade and straighten it out, and you find yourself a piece of wood to act as a guard to keep the enemy's blade from sliding down and cutting your hand. Mostly you'll be using things that you've already got. Renaud blinked. He stopped asking questions, but he couldn't stop thinking them. They bunched up inside his brain like cattle all trying to force their way through a single gate. Bring all your stock, Renaud, Thulin said. You'll eat them, or your men will eat them, and you'll want the milk. And if you don't, then there'll be men you can trade with for beef or mutton. Food will be scarce, what with everything spoiling so much and the winter stores having run low. Bring everything you've got. Dried beans, dried fruit, everything. Renaud leaned back against the gate to his yard. He felt weak and limp. Finally, he forced out just one question. Why? Thulin hesitated. Then stepped away from the wagon, laying a hand on Renaud's shoulder. I'm sorry to be so abrupt. Well, you know how I am with words, Renaud. I don't know what that storm is, but I know what it means. I have never held a sword, but my father fought in the Aiel War. I'm a borderlander, and that storm means the end is coming, Renaud. We need to be there when it arrives. He stopped, then turned and looked to the north, watching those building clouds as a farmhand was the poisonous snake he found in the middle of the field. Light preserve us, my friend. We need to be there.
Give me 1 second
And
and we'll
he
be right
removed
back.
his hand and climbed back into the wagon. Renaud watched them ease off, nudging the oxen into motion, heading north. Renaud watched for a long time, feeling numb. The distant thunder cracked, like the sound of a whip smacking against the hills. The door to the farmhouse opened and shut. Owain came out to him, gray hair in a bun. It had been that color for years now. She'd grayed early, and Renaud had always been fond of the color. Silver, more than gray, like the clouds. Was that Thulin? Owain asked, watching the distant wagon throw up dust. A single black chicken feather blew across the roadway. Yes. And he didn't stay? Even to chat? Renaud shook his head. Oh, but Galanha sent eggs. She took the basket and began to transfer the eggs into her apron to carry them inside. She's such a dear. Leave the basket there on the ground. I'm sure she'll send someone for it. Renaud just stared northward. Renaud? Owain asked. What's gotten into you, you old stump? She's polished up her pots for you, he said. The ones with the copper bottom. They're sitting on her kitchen table. They're yours if you want them. Owain fell silent. Then he heard a sharp sound of cracking, and he looked over his shoulder. She had let her apron grow slack, and the eggs were slipping free, plopping to the ground and cracking. In a very calm voice, Owain asked, Did she say anything else? He scratched his head, which hadn't much hair left to speak of. She said the storm was coming, and they had to head north. Thulin said we should go too. They stood for another moment. Owain pulled up the edge of her apron, preserving the majority of the eggs. She didn't spare a glance for those that had fallen. She was just staring northward. Renaud turned. The storm had jumped forward again. It seemed to have grown darker somehow. I think we ought to listen to them, Renaud, Owain said. I'll go fix up what we'll need to bring with us from the house. You can go around back and gather the men. Did they say how long we'll be gone? No, he said. They didn't even really say why. Just that we need to go north for the storm.
Call into this stream for tonight.
This is
I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support.
You just get the men ready.
Till next time, everyone. Take care of the house. Y'all stay safe out there. She bustled inside, and Renaud forced himself to turn away from the storm. He rounded the house and entered the barn.